B.F. Skinner contends that man in his conceit refuses to accept what he really is, an organism shaped by his environment. In Dr. Skinner's controversial book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity, he expresses the view that our individual and our cultural ills derive largely from the persistent and mistaken notion that there is in each of us an inner man who is somehow immune to environmental shaping, somehow ultimately free. Dr. Skinner denies the existence of this autonomous man and deplores what he calls the literature of freedom and dignity, which perpetuates the myth. Dr. Skinner sees each of us as wholly determined by our environment. It follows that to change our behavior, we must change and control our environment. The significant changes in human behavior, which most serious thinkers regard as necessary if man is to survive, can, in Skinner's view, only be effected through conscious, systematic control of the entire human environment, behavior modification, on a massive scale. Dr. Skinner's supporters claim he is the herald of a new constructive age. It has been called the era of conscious control. But his critics ask, who is to control the controllers? They argue that his views, leaving no room for basic human rights, are an open invitation for a new form of totalitarianism, and that his philosophy attacks the principles of human freedom and dignity on which our culture is based.
Because I'm not attacking freedom, I'm not attacking dignity, I'm not attacking anything on which a successful government could possibly be based. It's just, I'm talking about something beyond these things. I'm not for depriving people of freedom. I want them to feel free as much as they've ever felt free, and I'd like to have that, like to have them feel freer than they do now. And I want people to be achievers. I don't want to deprive them of the chance to do the things for which we give them credit. But much more is possible, and I think we are failing to do the kinds of things that we could do because we are misunderstanding what we mean by freedom and dignity, and it's standing in our way. Many of the people who reviewed my book have mentioned rats in mazes or dogs in dinner bells. If that's what I was talking about, if it's not. It's quite surprising to me now, looking back on it, how little the world in general knows about operant conditioning, and I would include many psychologists. It's an extremely advanced, rigorous science. There are hundreds of laboratories throughout the world that are doing this work.
Just how free is man?
Well, of course, it depends on what you mean by freedom. I think traditionally the struggle for freedom has been concerned with freeing men from what we call aversive events, punitive events, annoying events, discomfort, and that kind of thing. And I'm all for that. I wouldn't change it. I would not deprive man of that kind of freedom. I think he could do a very much better job, however, in living a day in his life free of threatening, coercive, punitive control. That was fine. And I think when you have to free the individual from despots, tyrants, people who control through punitive methods, the best way is to build up the individual, to convince him that he can be free, that the power derives from him which is being used against him, and so on. I'm all for that. I'm all for building the individual up. But what has happened is that the control has therefore been branded as wrong because it is something we want to escape from. We don't recognize the fact that we are also controlled when we do what we want to do, when we feel free. So the feeling is the thing that's wrong here. If you simply say freedom is feeling free, when I can do what I want to do, I am free, and that was what people like Voltaire and Leibniz and others said in the literature of freedom, then you're stuck, because that doesn't give you any preparation whatsoever for dealing with the kinds of control that people will exert by making you want to do what you want to do. And when you do it, you please them. That's what they're working for, and you are therefore vulnerable. And the literature of freedom has never properly taken into account the dangers inherent in the kind of control that works through volition rather than through punishment.
Then when I may feel free, but I'm still being controlled.
Absolutely. We're all controlled all the time. And that's one thing I think that we simply must recognize. And until we do, we're likely to worry about control. But you're controlling me, I'm controlling you. Parents control their children, the children control parents. employers control workers, workers control employers. This is going on all the time. You're controlled by the physical environment you live in. You're controlled by the social environment. This is going on and has to be recognized as such. Now, the literatures of freedom do not prepare us to deal with very much of this. They're only concerned with the kinds of things you want to get away from. In other words, aversive control.
Suppose people read your book, take the message seriously, realize that they are being controlled under all sorts of conditions. What happens to their feeling of freedom? Will they lose it?
Well, I don't know. I certainly believe that my own behavior is entirely a function of, in the first place, my genetic endowment. That's the evolution of the species and small divisions of the species. My past history, my family, my religion, my government, my schooling, all of these things, the physical environment in which I live, and the present situation. I am absolutely sure that that is all there is in the determination of what I'm doing at this very moment. I don't feel discouraged by this. I don't feel unhappy about this at all.
You don't feel like a puppet?
I don't feel the least bit like a puppet, because the whole opera kind of thing is not string pulling to make a figure dance. It is arranging a world in which a person is giving out with behavior. He's doing things which affect that world and which in turn affect him.
How does the concept of man's inherent dignity stand in the way of behavioral technology?
Well, dignity is a tricky word. I use it more, closer, I think, to the French usage of worth. A person, what he's worth, what he deserves credit for. And we do want to give people credit for what they've done, and we tend to do this when we don't know why they've done it. As if it's a very conspicuous kind of thing, we give the causes the credit. If it's inconspicuous, we give them the credit. And this is important. We want credit ourselves for doing what we've done and so on. Now, once that is a practice, then we are likely to reject any technological advances which seem to give us less of a chance to do something worthwhile or admirable. I make the point in my book that fireproof buildings leave no place for brave firemen, and a peaceful world would leave no place for military heroes. And I think to some extent we have actually preserved dangers because we want the credit for dealing with them effectively. I think that it's hard to prove this, but I really believe that we are trying to defend the inner worth of a man, but we should be working on the environment which is really responsible for his behavior.
Well, we seem to be partway there. In other words, if someone commits a crime, we go a long way toward explaining it in terms of his environment.
Yes, we're very uneasy about that, though. I think we have to accept statistical facts such as that most people who commit crimes come from bad backgrounds, and if you could change the background, presumably, you would correct for the crime. Now, that isn't always true, of course, but that's just because we don't know enough about describing the actual background in question.
Is one of the reasons, perhaps, that we're uneasy about explaining crime in terms of environment because we somehow realize that if that means we have to go all the way and explain our good behavior in terms of our environment?
Yes, nobody objects to an environmental explanation of his bad behavior. The juvenile delinquent says, oh yes, I'm a crazy mixed up kid, that's what's wrong with me, I have a bad background and so on. But everybody objects if you say the environment is responsible for your achievements, because you want credit for those. You don't want to be blamed, but you want to be praised. And these are reasonable things, and we can understand why this has been the case. But it's another example of how mixed up we are, really. We're all crazy mixed up people when it comes to why people behave as they do.
Why do we need behavior technology?
Well, if you're satisfied with the world the way it is now, I can't convince you that we do. I think we're making a mess of things, and these are all problems which have to do with behavior, not with physical or biological technology. I do know that the nations of the world are spending about $200 billion a year on armaments. Now, it's all a waste, of course. 10 years later, it's no good. The people are too old. The planes won't fly, and the better ones are all coming along, and so on. So $200 billion a year are wasted. They do nothing for mankind. Now, if any big corporation had a very large segment of its resources going into waste that way, they would do some research and development to find out how it could be stopped. Let's say we'd put 10%, say. So we ought to take $20 billion a year and get everybody to chip in on this and find out how we can avoid spending $200 billion a year. Well, for $20 billion a year, think what you could do. You could have a really effective United Nations. You could have interchange programs back and forth so we get to know each other a lot better. We could solve some of the crucial problems that are leading to war and so on in other ways. And I think you would have to do a great deal of this with the application of behavior techniques.
And what's stopping us from doing this?
Well, that's the whole point. What's stopping us is that we are not aware of the need for a design of a culture. See, we allow things to reach a certain stage without any particular design, and we feel that's all that can be done because we are afraid of any kind of actual manipulation of people. That's what the literature of freedom has done to us. It's kept us from actually solving our problems in an effective way.
What would happen to creativity in the control society?
Well, I think we'd have more of it than we have now. Instead of saying that there's something in the creative artist which explains the creativity and novelty in his work, I would look at the conditions which have led him to be an artist, which have given him his techniques. And I believe that the practicing artist learns how to increase the mutation, so to speak, which lead to novelty in his productions, and then through selection, his own good taste and so on, to rescue those which really are creative works and add them to the possessions of the world.
Well, if society is perfect and there are no negative reinforcements, there are no aversive conditions, why would anyone want to write a great novel?
Well, I'm not sure they want to write what we now call great novels, but there will always be a great deal we don't know. There will always be a concern about much that remains this side of a scientific analysis. I'm sure that we are never going to have a complete knowledge of human behavior. We're not going to be able to formulate our relationships with our friends and our children and our wives and husbands and so on. These are the things which will remain problems in the sense that they are inadequately treated. The science of physics does not clarify everything about the physical world so that we're no longer interested in the curious forms that plants take and so on. We see beauty in the physical world, even though physics can, if we press them, physicists can give a better account.
Now, suppose we want to set up behavioral technology. How do we choose the controllers?
The controllers choose themselves. Bear in mind that we're not talking about any totalitarian figure at the top who's going to run everything. We already have controllers. We have teachers. Now, it's the responsibility of the teacher to take a certain number of students in his care for a certain amount of time and to arrange conditions under which they learn something. Now, the teacher of the future would have the same assignment. He'd be much better in working it out.
So the controllers of the future would be the controllers of today?
Absolutely, but they would control much more effectively.
Well, who keeps the controllers honest? Now, when they know what they can do.
That's a very important point. Who keeps the controller honest, or who keeps him benevolent? Let's put it that way. That's the classical term. And I think there's a great mistake here in putting your faith in benevolence. This is a feeling. This is one of those internal possessions, excuse me, of autonomous men. It is not the compassion or the wisdom even of the controller, but the culture which puts him in a position to control. I raised this question in a paper I did at the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation for Mental Retardation. They had a big thing in Washington on compassion in the care of the retardate. And my paper was really an attack on the whole program of the meeting, in a sense, because what I was arguing was you cannot count on compassion. You can count only on the conditions which are responsible for the behavior of those who control others. There are 5 great classical examples of mistreatment: the care of old people, old folks' homes, the care of small children who have been deserted by their parents, orphans and that sort of thing, prisoners, psychotics, and retardates. Now, why have these always been classical examples of mistreatment? Not because compassionate people were not involved there, but these people cannot counter-control. They can't do anything against those who were working with them. Old people are too old, children are too small and too little. Prisoners are there under armed control, and they haven't, unless they manage to get some guns somewhere. Psychotics and retardates are unable to escape from or counter-control. And under these conditions, the most compassionate person deteriorates, and he becomes careless, then callous, and then cruel. This has happened again and again and again. Now, there's no help for this in trying to find compassionate people. You put them into that system, and they'll deteriorate, and they'll become less compassionate. What you want are the counter-controlling effects. You want to make sure the treatment of one kind is condoned, treatment of another kind is opposed.
And how are you sure that you get that kind of a
well,
situation?
we step in to improve, let's say, the treatment of prisoners. We're not the prisoner, we're not the authorities, but we realize something is wrong with the situation, so we impose restrictions on what the authorities can do, and we may impose restrictions on what prisoners can do.
Do you think behavior modification can be abused?
Everything can be abused.
It's just a tool, in other words.
Well, you can abuse it in the way you care for your children, the way you teach, the way you psychotherapy. These principles can all be misused.
Then a totalitarian government could use your methods to set up a repressive state or to maintain one?
Yes, I'm afraid so. They can also use an atomic bomb. For the same, there's nothing in the bomb itself or in the behavior modification which guarantees it's going to be used by good people.
A number of attacks that have been made on you have mentioned the fact that, in their eyes, behavior modification is being used, say, in China today.
Yes.
And because of that, they're horrified at the thought that we might apply it in this country.
Yes, well, the word fascism, some critic pointed out, surfaces frequently in discussions of my book. They usually are good enough to say that I am not a fascist, but that I give aid and comfort to fascism. Well, in the first place, every fascist state I've ever heard about uses aversive control. Its citizens are afraid not to behave as the government dictates. And I've spent all my life on the one to punitive control and to argue in favor of them against punitive control. So that if we're talking about the techniques used by fascism or any totalitarian state, then I would be definitely in favor of the kinds of techniques that lead people to feel free and enjoy what they're doing. Now, it is still possibly true that I give aid and comfort to any way of life which is concerned with improving its practices. Whether I give them an advantage is another thing, and that all depends on whether democracies, what we call a democratic way of life, can indeed take advantage of what we're learning about human behavior. And my book expresses my own concern that the curious history of freedom and dignity as concepts in our thinking about society, whether that has not somehow or other made it impossible for us to take advantage of what we are now discovering about human behavior. And in that case, somebody else will, and they will go down the drain. And I think this was worth considering.
Well, now that we've gone beyond freedom and dignity, what's left? What is man?
Well, I think what we're coming to is an understanding that cultures also evolve, and that any practice which makes a culture more likely to survive will therefore be preserved by the culture which does survive. Now, that's not an invariable rule any more than natural selection failed to make mistakes. Natural selection had to some forms that didn't survive. And operant conditioning shapes behavior, which is not really adaptive. And the evolution of cultures will strengthen cultures temporarily, which are not going to be good in the long run. That's inevitable. But I think that the principle still holds, that we are concerned really with the ways in which the human organism, given its genetic endowment, has created an environment, social and physical, in which the human individual can behave most effectively, develop all of those behaviors of which he is capable, and in doing so, make that particular way of life most likely to solve his problems. Now, some students often say to me, why should I care whether my way of life survives? And the only honest answer, I think, is that you shouldn't. There's no real reason. But if your culture hasn't convinced you that there is, so much the worse for the culture. You're not going to survive anyway. The culture is the only thing that will survive.
Then the ultimate value has to be the survival of the culture?
I think, yes, and this is not a value we choose. It's the value imposed upon us. Just as you would in the evolution of a species, you might say to a fish during the evolutionary process, where are you going? What is your final value? What's going to be the final perfectionistic state of this particular species? No one can say.